that was designed to be an enhancement to what became law after last session and was supported by the Secretary of State. This bill deals with voting ID requirements. They testified that it would establish in law the approved form of identification and provide for additional methods by which voters can prove a new residence if that address, the address listed on the voter's identification, is no longer correct. In Section 2, the changes would allow for alternatives for individuals to provide proof of residence when the individual's address on their identification is out of date. The bill allows an expired North Dakota driver's license or non-driver ID card to be a valid form of identification, providing the information on the card is still correct. Clarifications were made to reflect that a North Dakota driver's license, North Dakota ID card, and tribal ID are the approved forms of identification issued by the state, and that the long-term care certificates would be the only remaining alternative form of identification prescribed by the Secretary of State. A passport or military ID card would be a valid form of identification for uniformed service members, their qualified family members that are stationed away from home, and qualified electors who are living outside the United States. Also, there is clarification that a voter must reside in the precinct 30 days or more prior to the day of election, and that if that is not met, a voter may vote in the previous precinct of residence. Section 3 clarifies the identification requirements that must be provided on the absentee or mail ballot application form. This section also clarifies that voters living within or with a disability that prevents the individual from obtaining a valid form of identification are the only individuals for whom an attester is a valid alternative, and that an attester may not attest for more than 4 applicants. Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, your Committee on Government and Veterans Affairs recommends a due pass with a 9-5 vote and requests that you concur.
Is there any discussion? Representative Overson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the bill carry or yield to a question, please?
Representative Koppelman, would you yield to a question?
I will, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Overson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Koppelman, I don't see the language in here, and if I recall correctly, it was just something the Secretary of State decided to allow. Was there discussion about the student certificates and whether or not we are going to continue to allow the Secretary of State to authorize those?
Mr. Speaker and Representative Overson, there was some discussion in opposition to this bill, concerned that the Secretary of State would no longer allow those certificates. In testimony on both sides of the bill, we heard that student certificates were potentially easily forgeable, as they were just printed with an inkjet printer on a piece of paper, and that some of these other forms of identification would allow the same access to students by allowing them, if they had not updated their address on their proper form of ID, that they were able to bring in a bill of some sort, like a bank statement, utility bill, or otherwise, that was dated 30 days prior. So I believe that answers your question.
Representative Overson.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, but if I may continue.
You may continue.
Thank you. Representative Koppelman, if there's concerns about the certificate for students, is there not the same concerns for the certificates for long-term care? I haven't seen one of those certificates. I've dealt with the student certificates. Are they similar, or is this a completely different
Representative Koppelman.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Overson, I do not believe that in the process of hearing this bill we did see a copy of a long-term care certificate. We did see a copy of a student certificate from one of the universities, and so I don't know if I can answer your question.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the bill carry or yield to another question?
Representative Koppelman, would you yield to another question?
I will, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Koppelman, I guess I'm a little bit confused on page 2, line 27. There's some language that it says a current or expired driver's license. I guess my question is, if the license were to be expired, and I had heard the surrounding conversation about the certificates and changes of address, why would an expired, I didn't understand why an expired driver's license would be allowed to be used as an ID if that couldn't be proved to be, to me, if it's expired, I guess I don't understand how that could be proved to be their current address.
Representative Koppelman.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Hansen, as I understand it, when you have a driver's license with the ID with the Department of Transportation, They maintain what your current address is in their system, and you're actually able, unlike the old days where you had to go in and get a physical new driver's license that had your address on it. Now you can go online and update your address as you move without necessarily getting a physical ID. And so as you might come to the polling place with your current driver's license that has an old address on it, in the computer system they have that updated. Well, in the case of an expired address, or excuse me, an expired ID where the address is still current in their system, that sort of meets the requirements of showing current residence under, or at least eligibility to vote under our law, and so that was deemed to be appropriate.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Wallman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. I personally will be resisting this bill, and the reason is that the Cass County Auditor corresponded with the GVA committee letting us know that, and of course that's where NDSU is, many students, as everyone knows, that the student certificates worked fine, and he was perfectly pleased with the way that they worked, and this bill would make those not available to students who would like to vote, just for clarification. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lauser.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill had a 2.5-hour hearing, and it included input from college students from NDSU. And I would hope that we have a higher than minimal expectation out of our young people. And this bill only asks those students that don't have and already have a driver's license with their current address to get a free ID card for the purposes of voting. Making voting in our state as easy as pie still requires a little bit of effort from those consuming the pie. Most freshmen and sophomores presumably would be voting for the first time, and if voting matters, they should be happy to get an identification card like everybody else does. Knowing a year and a half in advance of the election should give plenty of time to get a free ID card. In some areas of code, we reference adults as children if they're under 26 years old, but I think it's appropriate to treat people that are old enough to vote as adults. I'd say let's stick to our values of personal responsibility in this state and require proper identification to vote.
Is there further discussion? Representative Mock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the bill carrier yield to a question?
Representative Koppelman, you yield to another question.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I will.
Representative Mock.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Koppelman for yielding. I'm looking at the DOT's website, and the way I understand House Bill 1333, that one of two, that your name and address must be included in one of two locations, either printed on an official driver's license or non-driver's license issued by the state, or it must appear in the central voting file, which is updated using DMV records prior to the election. And I'm looking at the website, and I know that in North Dakota law, if a person moves and has a new address, that they are required to update their driver's license on the DMV's in their database within 10 days, and that they would not necessarily be issued a new ID. Did the committee discuss, or was it mentioned in committee, how an updated driver's or an updated address in the database is verified by the Department of Motor Vehicles? How it's verified that that individual actually resides at that resident prior to the election date?
Representative Koppelman.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Mock, I don't know if it was specifically discussed in committee discussion as to how they verify that. There was a lot of discussion as to whether or not we should make other allowances for people who fail to meet that requirement by law to update their address within 10 days. The central voter file is updated from DMV records, and I believe they stop the updates 30 days prior to an election. So it's presumed that whatever the address in their system was 30 days prior, that's your eligible address, and if you move after that, that it's not. But I do not believe they had discussed how they go about verifying it. I believe the individual goes onto the site and enters it in. If there's any additional verification beyond that, I don't believe we discussed it in committee.
If I may continue, Mr. Speaker?
You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think that's a part that concerns me, and thank you, Representative. I don't know if I have another question, but I'm a little concerned. North Dakota, for those that are not aware, was the first state to pass voter registration, but now we hang our hat on being the only state without it. voter registration is the presence of a central voting file, and the more I read what we've created, the more I read this bill and our current law, we have created a de facto voter registration system. There is a central voter file. Your name and your information, your address has to be located in that central voter file. And I get the importance of this verification, but I've also heard that our system has not been, the law has not been reconciled. We have not done a thorough cleaning of the current election statute to ensure that verification is in place. In listening to county auditors, the process for updating your driver's license is as simple as logging on to this website, the DOT website, putting your name and your current address, your most updated address in the system, and that becomes your voter information. So a county auditor could be rightfully concerned that a person could, if there is a competitive election somewhere in the state, could log on to the DMV's website. They could update their address to an apartment complex. And as the bill carrier spoke to, it reminded us, there's no verification. And they show up on the day of an election. Their driver's license says one location, but the central voting file shows another, and they're allowed to vote. Day after election, they can log back in and change their address. I mean, this is a problem. And so, I mean, 1333 is silent on this. It is a concern of mine. I think that this body, whether we pass 1333 or not, needs to have a serious conversation about what the purpose and intent of our election laws are and how we can best accomplish those needs. I'm not going to speak in opposition to this bill because of that. But we really need, if we're going to go down this path, we really need to be careful on what laws we're passing, what we're putting on the books, and make sure that we're doing it right. I get what this bill is trying to accomplish, but I think it is on us over this next interim to look into this section of code and really have a heart-to-heart with ourselves and the Secretary of State's office about what these laws are hoping to accomplish and how we are going about that. I do not believe House Bill 1333 addresses those problems. I think we've got a lot more work ahead of us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there further discussion? Representative Baining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the Assembly, just to address Representative Hansen's concern on the current expired driver's license, one of the reasons we put that in the statute was because we have a lot of old people that maybe your grandparents or something that quit driving and they want to keep their driver's license for an ID, so that would be a form of ID, and they could bring along one of their bank statements or billing statement. That's why we left that in, because a lot of them don't want to go get a new ID card or whatever, so we're allowing that in for that purpose. And then to address a couple more of the issues in there, currently you can go online, like Representative Mock said, you can go and change your address in there, but you can also go to the DOT office and change it without any verification as well. So if you want to go to the DOT office and change it today, you can go back tomorrow and change it again too. They don't ask for identification. I guess that's the way DOT sets it up, and they don't have any other system in there. And I guess that's basically probably the same way the student certificates are. There's no verification on them either. They can change that the day of the election from one place to another place. So, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, this has been a bill in work in progress for a couple of years, and now hopefully we've got most of the things ironed out in this bill, and I'm guessing there's always going to be some extra things that need to be changed or added in the upcoming elections, over the next bienniums and so forth. I would ask a green vote on this. Thank you.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, the House has before it for final consideration House Bill 1333. The clerk will open the key and you may record your vote. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Key will be closed and the clerk will take the record. Final vote shows 66 yea, 24 nay. 4 absent, not voting. House Bill 1333 is declared passed.